And Book TV's coverage of the National Book Festival continues. Catherine EBAN is next, talking about generic drugs.
Hi, I'm Catherine EBAN. My book is Bottle of Lies, the inside story of the generic drug boom. And I'm talking to you today from Truro, Massachusetts. I'm actually usually based in Brooklyn, New York, but we're hunkering down in Cape Cod this summer. My book is a true crime expose of the generic drug industry and takes the reader deep into the distant manufacturing plants in India and China that make most of America's low-cost medicine. Heavily reported over the course of 10 years, the book follows several key characters, an industry whistleblower, an FDA investigator, as they begin to uncover widespread fraud in these manufacturing plants. Question is, what made me want to pursue this topic? I'm an investigative journalist, and I have been at this for several decades. But in 2008, I got an unusual phone call. It came from a radio show host on NPR. He has a show called The People's Pharmacy. His name is Joe Graydon. And he called me with a tip. He said that listeners were calling into his radio program and complaining about their generic drugs, that they were having side effects or the drugs seemed ineffective. And when he took those complaints to the FDA, the response he got back was that the reactions were probably psychosomatic and that the patients were complaining because when they're switched to a generic, those drugs look different than their usual drugs. And he did not believe that. So he posed a question to me that I couldn't get out of my head, namely, what is wrong with the drugs? And that is really where my reporting began, as an effort to answer that question. Some people have noted that the book sort of begins with Gandhi in an ashram in India, which is quite remarkable. And what does that have to do with generic drugs? Well, it was World War II, and the British were in India, of course, and they were having to fight Germany, and there was fighting all over the world, and they needed pharmaceutical supplies for their army. And at that point, the Indians wanted their independence from the British. So basically, the British went to Gandhi and said, look, if you want independence, help us with pharmaceutical supplies for our army. And we will consider giving you freedom. And so the pharmaceuticals that the Indians started manufacturing and the active ingredients that they started making at that time grew into a giant industry in India. But it began actually with a bid for freedom. One of the main characters in the book is named Dinesh Thakur. He's a young engineer. He was at Bristol Myers Squibb in New Jersey, and an associate of his was going to India to work at India's largest drug company at the time called Ranbaxy, and recruited Dinesh to move his young family to India and join this company. So he does. He goes, and he gets a new boss who is the head of research and development. That boss begins to get worried about the quality of the data that Ranbaxy is filing with regulators around the world, because in order to get drugs approved, you have to submit quality data to regulators saying that your drugs meet standards. So his new boss gives Dinesh, and this was in roughly 2004, his new boss gives Dinesh an assignment. Look into all of Ranbaxy's worldwide regulatory filings and find out if the data is real or fake. So Dinesh Thakur takes his team, starts delving into the filings and into the data, and essentially uncovers Ranbaxy's secret, which is that for 200 drug products in 40 countries around the world, Ranbaxy has just invented data. They've just made up data in order to make substandard drugs look like they meet quality. In a very sort of dramatic series of events, Dinesh's findings are shown to the board of directors of the company, which order his findings destroyed, the computer on which his findings are created destroyed, and Dinesh is forced out of the company. And through a series of events, he decides to blow the whistle and takes this explosive information to the FDA, which then launches an 8-year investigation. And the actions surrounding this form the core of the narrative of Bottle of Lies. So it might surprise people to know this, but 90% of the US drug supply is generic. And that means that if you go to a pharmacy, almost certainly the prescription that you're getting is a generic. Even more surprising to people is the fact that almost 80% of the active ingredient in all our drugs, brand or generic, are being manufactured overseas, principally in China and India. And the majority of our finished dose generics are also coming from overseas. 40% of those drugs alone are being made in India. Now, under FDA regulations, any manufacturing plant that is sending its drugs into the US market has to be inspected by the FDA. So on paper, the system of regulation is identical. But the reality is that when the FDA inspects plants in the US, they show up unannounced. They stay as long as needed. But because of all the complex logistics of overseas inspections, the FDA will announce that it's coming months in advance for overseas inspections. So that gives manufacturing plants the opportunity to clean up, which they do. And one of the things that I expose is how they send data fabrication teams into these plants when they have advance notice, which they routinely do. And they will make up documents, they will backdate documents, they will shred documents, they will sometimes even create new documents and steam them overnight in a sauna-like room to make them look old, as one example I uncovered. So, the question is not just, are they required to inspect, but what is the quality of those inspections? So, right off the bat, you have a very different situation. And it goes downhill from there. One of the things that I uncovered is that the industry uses a system of manufacturing that they call dual track production. Essentially, that amounts to adjusting the quality of the drugs depending on the market they're shipping into. So they may use their better ingredients and more safeguards for drugs that are being sent to the US or Europe, and actually worse drugs, fewer safeguards, poor quality ingredients for drugs being sent to Africa. Sometimes they will invent all the quality data of the drugs being sent to Africa, which essentially means that people in those markets are getting completely untested and unproven medication. So the manufacturing standards essentially are amounting to whatever they can get away with, which is really very troubling. There is one anecdote in the book where a US scientist who had joined the company Ranbaxy in India was very troubled and concerned about the quality of the AIDS drugs bound for Africa. And she raised it on a conference call with company executives. The medical director of the company said, "Who cares? It's just blacks dying." And that gave her a very vivid understanding of the standards and ethics of the company. You know, some people have said, oh, well, this is just an anti-generics book. And that's not actually the case, because it really does have profound implications for big pharma. So the two industries, the brand name companies and the generic companies, are not as separated as you might think. We have seen brand name companies buying generics companies or launching generic subsidiaries and moving their manufacturing to India and China as well. You know, they will talk about quality safeguards, but in fact, there are numerous instances, which I document in the book, in which they have no idea what's going on in their plants. You know, they think they know, and in fact, they don't. The US has seen its manufacturing of essential medicines steadily eroding. At this point in time, we make none of our own penicillin. All of that manufacturing takes place overseas. If you go fill a prescription for antibiotics for your child, the odds are that is going to come from overseas. So what we have seen is this erosion of the manufacturing of essential medicines in this country. You know, there have been people who have been warning for years that this is the national security risk. You know, we're dependent on other countries. We don't control our own flow of essential medicines. And as one source told me, you know, without drugs or drug ingredients from overseas, not a single pill or tablet could be made in this country. So if we fast forward now to this crisis that we're in with the coronavirus, you know, this has really come home to roost, because as every country struggles to contain this virus and to maintain a supply of essential medicines, you know, we are now sort of doubly dependent and experiencing drug shortages, which has led to the sort of obvious understanding that we need to make our own drugs in this country. You know, this is not impossible. It's very possible to do, but not without a huge political will to restore manufacturing to this country. You know, I will also say that it's hard for us to imagine a time when we didn't have the Food and Drug Administration, right? The regulation of the Food and Drug Administration is what allows any of us to go to a pharmacy and not think about the medicine we get, right? We assume that it will be safe and effective because it's actually required by regulation to be safe and effective. And every dose is required by regulation to be identical to another dose in the bottle. And that is all governed by an elaborate architecture of regulation called CGMP, Current Good Manufacturing Practices. These are very detailed regulations. You know, but the only thing that stands between us and pharmaceutical disaster is the ethics of manufacturing companies, which is often dubious, and effective regulation by the FDA, which is often inadequate. So, you know, this is something that I think it's important for readers to understand, you know, what is governing the safety of the pill that they're swallowing. And, you know, judging from the reviews of the book, that is something that Bottle of Lies will make you stop and think about. As an investigative journalist, I have long felt compelled to find out the truth. It might be a sort of personality trait. I hate being lied to. I always want to figure out sort of what's behind the curtain. And I hate unanswered questions. So, in 2008, when the radio show host Joe Graydon asked me, what is wrong with the drugs? I felt I had to figure that out. And it took me 10 years to do that, in which time I traveled to India, China, Africa, Europe, Mexico, across the US. I could never have imagined that what sounded like a relatively simple question would lead me on this kind of quest. And, at a number of times I felt like quitting, but on the other hand, I sort of knew that if I didn't continue, not only was I not going to be able to answer the question, but the question might not actually get answered. So, it felt like a giant puzzle, and I was trying to put these pieces together. I think that I'd like to think that investigative journalists do serve an essential function in a democracy of holding power to account, and trying to get crucial information to the public. So I feel that it's that kind of mission that drove me to complete Bottle of Lies, even though I dearly wanted to give up at various times. So the resulting book is a mosaic of those puzzle pieces driven by characters and heroes who felt as compelled as I did to seek the truth. So I think that there's a kind of satisfaction to the reading experience of getting to that truth. And also, I guess for me, a satisfaction in knowing that I've been able to assemble it. And I just think that, that kind of journalism plays an important role, maybe now more than ever. So it's been just wonderful to be able to participate in a literary festival like this one, to be able to reach readers who are curious and want answers. And I hope everyone out there stays healthy and well.
And here at Book TV, we're